Dear listeners and viewers, today, with God's help, we are starting a new project. Why with God's help? I am often criticized in the comments. I am an atheist, and I say this many times. But, nevertheless, I address with such traditional phrases for Ukraine, because we are all on the front now. Some are on the front in the trenches, some are in the rear helping our fighters. We are all in the trenches, and there are no atheists in the trenches. Therefore, with God's help, today we are starting a project. I haven't been thinking for long. I have bad creativity. I have bad imagination. I called it Historians on Saturdays, or maybe Saturday meetings with historians. In this project, I will be recording an interview with professional historians, with professional teachers, methodists, specialists in the field of textbook, writing, for as long as I will be able to, as long as my interlocutors will be able to. I hope that every Saturday, or at least bi-weekly, there will be a new recording with a modern historian. The first recording was kindly agreed upon with Serhiy Hromenko, candidate of historical sciences. He is a positive person. I personally have never talked to him. I am friends with him on Facebook. But today he brought such a stream of positivity into my life. My understanding of the war and what is happening. I invite you to watch Serhiy Hromenko. Good evening, Mr. Serhiy.
Greetings, Mr. Vitali.
I would like to introduce you to my viewers. Not everyone knows about you, so I will try to add a few words about you. Dear viewers, Serhiy Hromenko, citizen of Ukraine, Crimean, candidate of historical sciences, writer and publicist, an expert of the Ukrainian Institute of the Future. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
The last book I know is from 2023. It came out in electronic form, I think. It has a very interesting title, Why Ukraine Will Win, or Is Winning. You did not mark stress in the word on purpose, as I understand. So, is it will win, is winning, or is it up to the reader to choose?
This is not a bug, it is a feature. When I was writing it at the end of the past, or rather, I should say, last year, and at the end of the year before that, well, when Ukraine was not in euphoria, but in significant upheaval after the liberation of Kharkiv, it seemed, and Kherson, it seemed that after one more push, we will reach the next goal, at least shores of Azov Sea, and later we would see what's to come. And it seemed to me that the best option would be to explain why Ukraine is winning. But during 2023, we did not manage to reach all the objectives that we set ourselves. Somewhere, we advanced much more than we could have dreamed. For example, we completely pushed the Russian Black Sea Fleet from the western part of the Black Sea, and even from Sevastopol. Nobody could dream about it. No, and this was felt by everyone in Ukraine. This winter was absolutely not like the previous one, so there were great successes. On the other hand, we did not move as far as we wanted on land, and this also has its explanations. And then, obviously, it seemed to me that it would be better to talk about not why Ukraine is winning here and now, but why Ukraine is winning in principle. In general, I remain a historical optimist. Yes, not 2 or 3 weeks, but maybe 2 or 3 years. But Ukraine will win if there won't be any absolute disasters. So, considering this, I ended up with such a decision. I did not specify the stress, did not say how to do it correctly, and leave it to the interest of each reader at that particular moment of time when he or she will read this book.
I remember your post that you felt that, for example, you feel as you are in, as far as I remember, in the first half of 1943, going with analogies, and then your, so to speak, feelings changed a little in the other direction. That was somewhere in 1944, right? How did you feel? Am I wrong? Am I wrong?
In fact, we are still in 1943, Dr. A great battle on the Kursk salient did not take place, which we all hoped for. We hoped that we would finally stomp them somewhere near Zaporizhia. This did not happen. This does not mean that this will not happen. It will happen, but later. Perhaps the offensive will be not only contrary to our, but also to Russian expectations, not in the Zaporizhia direction, but in the Kherson direction, where they do not have much fortifications. But we also have logistics problems there. But still, it is possible that this great victory will be achieved under Kherson, but it will definitely be, and perhaps next year. More precisely, this year, because this year has already come.
I will continue to present you. This is just the beginning. I follow your work. As far as I understand, this is your previous book, right?
Yes, I wrote that as well, back in 2021.
If you didn't know how the negotiations between the government of the Skoropadsky and the Kuban and Crimean governments were going on, then here you go. A small advertisement. And in 2018, there was a historical essay, as far as I understand, about Bobo Khan.
It was published as a book, 250 pages total.
For me, it seemed that it was much smaller. So, a full-scale investigation into the expedition of Petro Bolbokan to Crimea, and you are one of the authors, because I very often advertise this edition of The History Without Censorship, 10 volumes.
There was such a miracle in 2014, 2016 with Ukrainian non-fiction literature.
Yes, it was a great hit. After the 10-volume book, I don't remember, history book, back in early 2000s, but there was a huge authors team of the Institute of History. Can't remember the name of the book.
Ukraine Across the Centuries.
Ukraine Across the Centuries, right. If you want to see something more academic, feel free to take a look. My first question, Mr. Serhiy, you are a professional historian. Where did you get your history education?
After all, that is no secret. I grew up in Crimea. And in Crimea, I graduated from the historical faculty of the Tavrian National University. And there I studied in the master's degree. And I defended my thesis in Dnipropetrovsk. Well, then. In Dnipropetrovsk National University of Oghuz-Honchar.
What was the topic of your candidate thesis, so that people know how the story begins?
In simple words, as opposed to the formal name for the attestation commission, it was dedicated to the Polish historiography of the history of Crimea in the long 19th century, from the very joining of Crimea, from the first annexation of Crimea to the Russian Empire, to the onset of the First World War.
That is how Polish historians described and evaluated these events. And let's move on to the main questions. Well, the truth is, again, that was the case with Ogun, when I knew him as a specialist on the Yarn and for some reason he offered me to talk about China, because he was no longer interested in those topics, and for some reason he started to be interested in China.
Just like you proposed a number of questions related to the history of Crimea, but not the history of Polish historiography. Who needs Polish historiography now, especially of the 19th century Crimea? This is a narrow topic. I hoped that someday I would deal with it in more detail and deeper, and I could go into some broader generalizations. But after all, this is not so relevant after 2014. Maybe later, when all this is over, when the Ukrainian troops return to Crimea, there will be a need for further research in Western historiography in the Free Crimea, because there is a plus or minus understanding of English, French, and much less German historiography. Yee. I began to discover Polish historiography of Crimea, and that is it so far. But there are many other countries, and then national historiographies also require research. But I think this is a matter of the future. After moving to Kyiv in March 2014, decided to focus on what is relevant here and now, on explaining to Ukrainians the entire history of Crimea and Russian-Ukrainian relations through lens of Crimea. Meanwhile, academic research of Polish historiography can wait for now.
Thank you. Serhiy Hromenko. So, can we consider the large-scale war between Russia and Ukraine irreversible? And whose role is more important, the freedom of will of Putin in his choice, or the historical tracks that Russia have been riding for more than a century?
You see, there is a big problem with the fact that Western journalists, analysts, and politicians unfortunately sometimes call the current phase of the Russian-Ukrainian war the War of Putin. Even those historians and politicians who, in principle, cannot be suspected of being Russophilic or Ukrainophobic, they repeat this determination over and over again. And it seems that if it weren't for Vladimir Putin, there would be no war. And provided that Putin is taken down, everything will instantly be settled in the Russian-Ukrainian relations. The truth is that Putin is the last, most important, but only one of the links of the chain that led to the whole of today's history. That is, not in an empty place it turned out to be a war. This idea about the war between Russia and Ukraine was not praised by Putin in an empty place. Because Putin praised it, there is no doubt about it. We do not remove his blame from it and do not deny it. But the fact that all of Russia during the last 30 years has turned to this idea, we can repeat and finally turn to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Well, this is unfortunately true. And we can look at how Russia has been gradually re-imperializing itself, starting in the 1990s. Here, I will not take responsibility from Boris Yeltsin, who in 1993, in order to solve his internal problems, initially attacked the parliament with the tanks, approved a super-presidential constitution, in fact, creating a ground for later Putin's authoritarianism. And then in 1994, he started a war in Chechnya. And the fact that he lost that war, in fact, helped Ukraine a lot. I will talk about it in more detail, but Ukraine had problems with Russia in the early 1990s. And perhaps they would have turned out to be much more, but the Chechen War drew Russia's attention from Ukraine, and the defeat gave Ukraine the opportunity an additional dozen-something years for peaceful development. But even then, back then, there were already voices about the fact that Crimea is a Russian land and it must be returned. And later they were coming up, and Moscow officials came to Simferopol, and in Sevastopol especially, and announced from the stands and on the squares that we will not forget, we will help. And all the same, I remember there was a story with one youth organization which organized a solemn symbolic dig-out of Perikop Isthmus. They went with shovels to the Perikop Isthmus to separate Crimea from Ukraine and to swim towards Russia. And all this idiocy was happening in the 90s, in the zeros. Ukrainians shrugged, and it seemed that all this would not happen. Well, now we understand that the Russian people, not all, but most Russian citizens, finally became convinced that stealing from others is a normal way to exist. And in 2008, it was not even Putin who formally demonstrated, but Medvedev who took away South Ossetia and Abkhazia from Georgia for good. There were problems there since the 90s, but such a big open war did not occur. And that war, it did not just cause a huge damage to Georgia, that's for sure. It also mobilized the Russian society. The authorities received just obscene. Well, at that moment, of course, obscene support from the people. It was especially important in the face of the international crisis of 2008. That is, Russia economically failed, but politically united, because the war against Georgia manifested all this Russian imperialism and chauvinism. And in 2014, Putin simply took advantage of the old model, took advantage of the idea. I'm sure that since at least 2008, the plan of capturing Crimea has existed, perhaps earlier, but since 2008 for sure. And in 2014, and it was applied. And again, Putin gets his obscene ratings, which he never had ever since 2014. 88% of population. Therefore, of course, once again, going back to the beginning and making conclusions. It is Putin's fault without a doubt. And I would like to see him on the bench of the lawsuit in Hague, as Milosevic once did, namely with the formulation of the resolution of the aggressive war. But to think that this is a war only of Putin and that Russia does not support him, this is a huge, huge mistake. And this must be taken into account when we talk about the future of the Russian-Ukrainian relations.
Thank you. Well, yesterday, or the day before yesterday, there was a series of statistics about this by Chicago University, I think. They said that from 63% to 67% of the population of Russia supports this war and believes that they are waging a war with the West. Ukraine is not a subject for them.
We need to understand that most of the 60% support mostly not the war itself, but Putin. If Putin says, that's it, we fought enough, let's go home, then I think that these 60% will say, sure, father, let's go. But nevertheless, there are 15, 20, 25% of absolutely stubborn fascists who will, regardless of what, even at the cost of Putin's resignation, demand the continuation of the war against Ukraine because it is a holy war. This must be taken into account for the future decades, not even years.
I, as blogger, I consider not 63%, but 93, 95% of the Russian population to be like that.
Those who are against it will not address you because they are afraid. This is a misconception that should also be taken into account. In totalitarian regimes, and Russia has become a totalitarian country after 1922, it is dangerous to doubt. Therefore, it is not worth thinking that they will actively speak there. This is a problem for Russia in the first place, but also for us.
They are there. They constantly ask me to hide their faces because they are really afraid. There was not a single person who would say that I am against Putin and would not ask me not to smear their faces. When did the current Russian-Ukrainian war begin? Why didn't it start sooner or later?
This is an important question for the Ukrainian internal discourse. You can hear from some that the war began on February 24. And so as a proof, of course, in quote marks, we take into account that there were no bombings, no tank columns. As a person who has not seen his home for almost 10 years, I can say that this is obviously nonsense. The war began in February, not of 2022, but of 2014, with the invasion of the Russians into Crimea. In principle, what we saw on the first days of February 24, 26, it was all on a smaller scale. But it was the same in Crimea on February 27th, up to March 5, more or less. Helicopters, captures of airfields, columns with APCs. Well, perhaps there were no tanks then, but nevertheless, literally, in a blink of an eye, for less than a week, the main cities, and in them the main, the most important centers, were captured by the Russian troops. And they did not even cover it up. Yes, they hid their faces. They did not have signs of distinction. But from the very first day, from the very morning of 27, over the captured buildings, we saw Russian flags installed. No one doubted anymore. And then at Pirikop, when, by the way, the Crimean Special Forces, the Crimean Berkut, took positions at Pirikop, they also raised Russian flags. So there were no doubts here. And this war began right then. What happened on February 24 2022 is the result of the decisions that were made then. I think that in the future textbooks, this story with this war will be divided into three parts, into three stages. The first stage is just February of 2014, the beginning of 2015. Such a phase of medium-intensive actions in Crimea, in Donbass. Attempts to destabilize Ukraine, the so-called Russian Spring, and the crackdowns in Kharkiv, Odessa in April and May. Then the Ukrainian counterattack. ATO in its early understanding. Then a separate phase of the invasion of Russian troops in August. The first Minsk agreements, Debaltsevo, second Minsk. And at the beginning of 2015, this first stage of the war ends. A line of disengagement is established that stays stable for the next 8 years. This will be the second stage. And on February 24, 2022, the third stage begins. That is, the fact that the scale has increased manyfold. The fact that the war has touched every Ukrainian without exception. This is obvious. But it is also obvious that the war lasts 10 years. And in Crimea, we saw the same. And in Donbass, we observed the same. And the Gradin missiles, with which the majority of Ukrainians got acquainted. This is all for the residents of Donbass, was reality back then. Already 10 years ago, and the occupation, and the joining Russia, and the issuance of Russian passports, and Russian FSB officers. This is all what the Kremlin saw in February 2014. So there are no questions here. This war, the current war, it started exactly, well, almost yes. In a month, it will be 10 years since the war began. It just lasts in different phases, and this is absolutely normal. Even the Second World War did not start with full-scale clashes of million-man armies. It began gradually, increasing the number of people joining the new peoples to the resistance. So did our war. And why didn't it start earlier? I've already talked about it.
Yes, you did.
Well, the first question, in fact, the basis for the Russian-Ukrainian War already existed in 1992. In 1992, we know that there were already hostilities. Well, they have been going on for several years between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Karabakh. There were already hostilities in Abkhazia, and Abkhazia then, with the help of Russia, separated from Georgia. And something is going on in Georgia itself in the form of a civil war. We know. And it is ideal, just fits our case, Transnistria. That in Transnistria, the separatism of Russians is growing. And the Russian army itself comes to these separatists for help. Sadly, it must be said that some Ukrainian nationalists were then fighting on the side of the Russians against the Moldovan government. And in what they are, well, and now I have not heard any one of them repent for this. And at the same time, in 1992, in summer, then it was called not Supreme Council, but Congress of People's Deputies and Supreme Council of RSFSR, now of the Russian Federation. They decided that the Act of 1954 that gave Crimea to Ukraine needs to be revised, as if the transfer was wrong, and that it should be discussed and talked about over again. And in 1993, once again, the Supreme Council approved the status of Sevastopol as a federal city of Russia. This could de facto mean declaration of war. And if it were not for the internal problems in Russia, then in 1993, we would have already seen a lot of polite people in Sevastopol. Because at that time, there were almost no Ukrainian soldiers in Sevastopol, and there were just countless Russian soldiers, and all this could have happened. And it didn't happen. And I would even say that from the end of 1991 to 1994, there was a Russian-Ukrainian Cold War in Crimea. Because Ukrainian sailors were beaten by Russian sailors, officers were thrown out of their positions. The attempts to side with Ukraine were cracked down on. The ship named CAR-112 wanted to go Sevastopol to Odessa under the Ukrainian flag in 1992. The Russians were shooting at it. Street fights took place between Russian and Ukrainian sailors in Sevastopol and Odessa. In 1992, the Crimean parliament again announced that Crimea is not an autonomous republic, but a republic, and it will negotiate with Ukraine about its future. And in 1996, they even elected their own president. The first and only in Crimea, Yuri Meshkov, was elected. That is, in fact, if all this had happened then, at the same time with Transnistria, we would now not even doubt that it all came to that. That Russia did not miss its chance to seize at least Crimea from Ukraine. And this did not happen because Russia had huge internal problems. In 1993, there was a civil war between the president and the parliament in Moscow. In 1994, there was a defeat in Chechnya. And there, of course, Yeltsin was not going to Crimea. Otherwise, it would have happened earlier. So what we see now is not a continuation, but an attempt to revenge Russia for the defeat in the 90s. They couldn't seize it back then, and so they try to do it again now. And this is another proof that not only Putin is alive in this war.
Thanks. I also always tell Russians that the main reason is revanchism. There are no bad nations. We understand it as normal people. But is there such a nation? Or is there no such nation as the Russians? I'm already hesitating lately. Why is this constant revanchist attitude constantly pressing on this territory?
Because there was no work done on the mistakes. I do not want to deny the positive qualities of the Russian people in any way, but they did not grow up to a political nation precisely because the imperial government, the Russian imperial government, not some other external force, was always preventing this. The last normal, more or less, elections in Russia were in 1989, back when communists were in power. And even then, those were flawed. And after that, every time in Russia there always were some kind of nonsense in the elections. And it is difficult to say whether late Yeltsin was even legitimate there after 1996, let alone Putin. And the problems with the Russians that we have now were there before. Germans, the French, and the British had those problems too. We are now very much ironic about the French. And I myself am a sinner. I am sorry. I constantly blame them for their white flags, for their tendency to capitulate and similar things. It was very difficult for the French to let go of their imperialism. In the 1960s, when they waged a colonial war for Algeria, they behaved the same way as the Russians, and in some places, perhaps even worse. But they lost the war against Algeria. They received a revolution as a result after 5-6 years. And then the rethinking began. The French political nation managed to rethink the lessons of colonialism, the lessons of defeat, and take the course for the future. Not the peaceful course, but at least without all this imperial legacy. And Russia could not do that. The current Russians are very similar to the Germans, but not the current ones, but after the First World War, who lost the war, but did not realize anything. And as soon as it got worse, they chose Hitler, and again threw themselves into the same swamp from which they barely got out. The same thing happened in Russia, but they lost the Cold War. Played with democracy a bit. And as soon as the crisis of the 1998 default occurred, they immediately wanted a firm hand. They got Putin, and now they are on the same trajectory as the Germans. I hope that it will end the same way. It will likely be that way. So the Russians, well, I will probably bring it up. They still have a chance. But now, the problem is that the government does not give the society the opportunity to make the right conclusions. At least right now.
Thank you. But when did Russia turn astray? And when Putin, the way he is has become possible.
Obviously, in 1993. Obviously, for Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, this is very important because this comparative politics gives us the opportunity to look without bias. 1993 to 94 were years of breakthroughs. We all came out of the same Soviet greatcoat, but came out different, and together we were going through, I don't know, not graduate tests, but some kind of interim tests, so to speak. And that was our first exam session. How did this first session in Ukraine go? In Ukraine, the miners' strikes, a big economic crisis, the prime minister against the president. The president then, I remind you, Leonid Kravchuk, agrees to the snap elections. Then he loses. And he absolutely peacefully and calmly passes the power to the prime minister, then Leonid Kuchma. And he goes, well, not into obscurity, of course, but he goes off the post, not holding the chair to the last, not setting up a fight. In Russia, it is absolutely opposite. In Russia, in 1993, at first, the parliament imposed impeachment on President Yeltsin. Yeltsin dissolves the parliament, and it all ends with the fact that in October, there were just barricades fired on the streets, hundreds of dead, and so on. And after that, already, in 1994, the civil war is also moving to Chechnya. That is, it is already absolutely connected processes. It was impossible to get out of this circle otherwise. And here comes the question of whether it is good or not that Yeltsin won the parliament. In the Russian parliament, as I said, the red and brown fascists were sitting. Absolutely seriously. The Russian parliament voted for the provisions on Crimea and Sevastopol. And there were also bastards and hypocrites of all sorts and trades. But history, if it teaches us something, it teaches us that the imperfect parliament's victory is better than good presidents, because the victory of the Russian parliament could have meant a fascist dictatorship here and now. But it could have meant that they would quarrel with each other, and there would be again such a basically competition and the possibility of such political development. And the victory of Yeltsin meant only one thing: a new constitution, a super-presidential government of the president, and that's it. That is, the dictatorship in Russia of the president began in 1993, before Putin. Putin only inherited it, the operating mechanism, and in Ukraine it was different. And in Belarus, if you look, there was also a situation. There, the first president, unlike, let's say, us, was not a dissident, of course. It would be an overstatement. He was more liberal.
Are you talking about Shushkevich?
Yes, I mean Shushkevich.
He wasn't president. He was the head of the parliament.
It should be said that there was no president in Belarus in the first years. That is, in Belarus, they could have gone without a president. But in the first elections, they voted for a strongman ruler who then positioned himself as a new face. And imagine that it was about the same as if in 1994 they chose Yanukovych instead of Kuchma. And then Alexander Grigorovich Lukashenko so much loved to be president that since 1994 he has never been removed. That is, not the same as in Russia, but not the same as in Ukraine. And this moment, in 1993-94, when we went through the first session there, it became clear that Ukraine, although very slowly, but with zigzags, was moving towards democratization. And Belarus and Russia froze, and then very quickly rolled back. And this is the problem with which they live. And now we all live because they have failed the tests at the 1993-94 exam session.
Let's move on to the question of Crimea. Why is Crimea so important for Russia? For their consciousness?
There is no definite answer. I think there is a whole complex of reasons related to historical traumas and some serious, actual, real things. Why traumas? Because without Crimea, there is de facto no ancient and early medieval history in Russia. And what is there is a deep periphery. The whole real history, the whole Roman Byzantine decline, and to it the Hellenic one, was concentrated mainly in Crimea. And every time Russia gets Crimea, or it is the end of the 18th century, or the beginning of the 20th century, or now in the 21st century, it warms the Russian national ego.
National pride of the Great Rus. I bet.
Yes, yes, yes. The pride of the great Russians is a very scary thing, in fact, because no one works with it, but on the contrary, they feed it. And so the capture of Crimea is immediately a plus of 50 years of history. It is very difficult to fight such a threat. And it is also necessary to understand that Sevastopol is located in Crimea, and Sevastopol, for the last 150 years, or a little more, is also the pride of Russian sailors.
Where they multiple times scuttled their fleet.
Yes. In fact, this is a huge problem from the point of view of collective psychiatry, that in Sevastopol, the Russians suffered severe defeats during the Crimean War, during the Second World War. But the myth about the city of Russian glory and the pride of Russian sailors is so strong that history cannot break the memory. This collective myth about Sevastopol is also very important. And now, when Sevastopol is ours, the base of the Black Sea Fleet, and everyone just runs away from it because there are graves of Russians there. Every inch of it was fought for. All of it. Now it's theirs again. No one out of Russians has become richer from it. No one from the Russians has become happier. No one has strengthened in the future, but on the contrary, the future has only gotten worse. But if Sevastopol is ours, then everything can survive. But this is only one half of the story. On the other hand, it should be understood that Sevastopol is really the only acceptable base of Russian Black Sea Fleet in the North Black Sea. Because what they had in Novorossiysk, it did not withstand any criticism. And until we started to shoot missiles at the headquarters and ships, they stayed there in Sevastopol till the end. For Russia, which still believes in its imperialism in the Mediterranean, it is just necessary to have Crimea as a base. And another reason, not so commonly brought up, well, is gas in the Black Sea. In fact, all these Boyko towers, which we have so much ironized in Ukraine in the past 20 years, they are pumping. Perhaps there is not as much gas there as in Siberia, but this is enough for Crimea. And if we look into it deeper, only some of it is developed. Perhaps there are even more gas fields there. We know that there are problems not only between Ukraine and Russia because of this. Israel, Gaza, Cyprus, Turkey, in the last few years have been very seriously conflicting due to the distribution of gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean. Therefore, this is a problem for a very distant future. I hope that when we finally take Crimea, our dependence on Russian gas, which is also in the Black Sea, will be significantly reduced, and the rest of such smaller, less important things. But nevertheless, 2 million people, of whom at least 1 million are ethnic Russians, pro-imperial, that are added to the demographic. They are the base against Ukraine. This was also clear to Hetman Skoropadsky, who in 1918 said, well, he wrote it in 1919, but he wrote in 1918 that Ukraine cannot live without Crimea. It's like a torso without legs, because whoever else would own Crimea, he will threaten Ukraine, both in Azov and in Odessa. It is impossible to develop the South if the Crimea is not Ukrainian, and it was also necessary for Putin to maintain a very important bridgehead against Ukraine. That is, It cannot be said that there is one definite reason, but the complex of these reasons makes us understand that either Russia owns Crimea or Russia is not an empire. This is how it looks like.
Thank you. Why do you think that in Ukraine many people didn't believe such a full-scale invasion would happen? For me personally, I also couldn't imagine that happen. And how did Russian propaganda achieve such success in the West?
I will not say that I am an ideal foreman. I would not say that I did not believe it myself, but I wrote a special article in 2017, Why There Will Be No Great War. It was 5 years ago, and it seems to me that in 2017, my arguments had some power. But in 2017, it did not happen, and for 5 years more, it did not happen either. Why did I write that there will be no great war? Because those 200,000 people that they had concentrated on the border are not enough to conquer Ukraine. Ukraine is much stronger than it was in 2014, and now won't give up without a fight. And when we look at the situation in 2022, we understand that on the one hand, I was wrong and the Great War began. And on the other hand, I was right and 200,000 people are not enough to conquer Ukraine. And we know that the Russians did not succeed. And even when they mobilized another 300,000 men, and then another 50,000 from prisons, still, this is not enough to conquer Ukraine, and the maximum is to maintain a southern corridor to Crimea. That is why many people believed and hoped that Putin understood it no worse than the Ukrainians. If I see that they cannot do it, then Putin must see that he cannot do it and not approve of idiotic decisions. But you all remember the recording of the meeting of the Council of National Defense, which was held just a few days before the Great Invasion, but after the declaration of recognition of the LPR by the Russians. There was a very significant moment when the head of the foreign intelligence, Naryshkin, is confused, babbling, mumbling, then spits something like, to accept Luhansk and Donetsk into Russia. And at that moment, it was a terrible moment. Not everyone understood it then. Putin was completely detached from reality. Even if his head of foreign intelligence, whom he should know that in 2-3 days there will be a great war, does not know this and spouts gibberish, what can he say about the rest? Now, we understand that for 10 years, Putin was told what he wanted to hear and not what was true there, that Ukraine is a failed state. Especially after 2019, that Ukraine will not resist, that they will look for a place to negotiate, that Ukraine does not have an army, that Ukrainians will meet them with flowers like in Crimea. And here again, the problem of Crimea played a bad joke with Ukraine and Russia. In Crimea, in fact, many people indeed welcomed the Russians. And in Ukraine, they didn't, and Russians realized it too late. And finally, he was convinced that the West would not come to help Ukraine. All this, that we were not given weapons for so long, is explained by the West. The West did not believe that we would hold on. The West thought that everything would be over quickly, and all this Western weapons would be in the hands of Putin. And only then, when Ukraine with its forces fought back from the Russian invasion near Kyiv, the situation has significantly changed, and the heavy Western weapons began to come. And before that, only handheld anti-tank missiles for the guerrilla.
Javelins? Laws.
In fact, the Russians are true masters in what? This is in the external propaganda. They succeeded in speculating on gas, speculating on the band rights in Ukraine and on their own greats, like we took Crimea there in a week. You think that we won't defeat Ukraine if everyone comes? They were bluffing and throwing dust in their eyes. Unfortunately, some of the bluffs, primarily nuclear, are still working from time to time. Even today, we are talking to you. Today in the morning, the former president Medvedev threatened to use nuclear weapons, which obviously means that something went bad again. Otherwise, they would not threaten with nuclear strikes. This all leads us to the conclusion that the West was mistaken about Ukraine and Russia. As in Ukraine, they were mistaken about Russia, and in Russia, they were mistaken about Ukraine and the West. If not for all those tens and even hundreds of thousands of victims that Ukraine has suffered and still suffers in this war, I would say that this is some kind of Homeric satire. But this is a kind of a tragic farce when everyone is mistaken about everyone, and the result is a meat grinder. And maybe if Putin had been more aware, there would not have been a war. But this happens with tyrants. When you sit in the top for too long, you just stop hearing what you don't like, and then you make decisions that lead to a catastrophe, not only for your country or your neighbor, but for the whole world in general.
Thank you. You have already touched on this question a little. Is there any historical analogy between the current stage of the Russian-Ukrainian war?
I would say that each analogy is a bit different, and the historical analogy is twice as different, but sometimes we just don't have other tools. And we will look at how the Russians planned the invasion, how they conducted it. This is a typical blitzkrieg of the Second World War. They planned to gather more troops in the column, to have a great gathering, not holding back in the rear, to go to Kyiv in 3 days. Then Ukraine will be paralyzed. And finally, somewhere, unfortunately, they succeeded. I hope that someday there will be an honest conversation in Ukraine about how exactly the South was unable to hold. And if we talk about the steps, there is no conversation of the North Tevria steps, but the question of why the bridges were not torn down in Dnipro and why the Russians entered Kherson will be debated. At least I would like, as a historian, to publicly talk about this after the war and to openly talk about why Kherson fell so quickly. And on the example of Kherson, this is the example that is necessary for understanding the Russian model. We see what was planned to do with Kharkiv, with Kyiv. Just like in Kherson, this did not happen because blitzkrieg requires, in fact, to be vastly superior than your opponent. The Russians were not vastly superior to the Ukrainians. Absolutely the opposite. The Ukrainians were superior from a tactical point of view and from a strategic point of view too. And the Ukrainians defeated the Russians. And all the attempts of the Russians to achieve such a maneuver victory like in World War II were not successful. And then Russia went to the model that they know even better. This is the model of the First World War, the positional one, when we see not tank columns and not marching battalions, but the overwhelming artillery fire. The Russians, in fact, you need to understand that the Russians had an advantage in almost everything, both in airplanes and tanks. But it was in several or so times, but in artillery, they had a tenfold advantage in their shells. And it was thanks to this that they managed to create fire barrages there and move in the south in the second half of 2022 and 2023. This is the truth which can't be denied, that Ukraine simply does not have as many shells as Russia. But the First World War is a catastrophe for almost all its participants. By and large, in the First World War, everyone except the United States were defeated. Britain was still with its own. France lost.
Well, loses a bit.
I want to say it again. In the end, the only real victors were the United States of America.
Everyone suffered a defeat.
Russia suffered losses to a greater or lesser extent, even those who were formerly victorious, such as Britain and France. But in fact, they also were very weakened. And about Germany and Russia in general, there is not even a point to talk. So, the fact that Russia has bet on a long war means that it will be doomed in the future. If it were only about the confrontation of just Russia against just Ukraine, there would be no chance for Ukraine. But since Ukraine has proven its combat capability, and the Western world has been supporting Ukraine to an extent with setback, this is enough to resist Russia. And in the long term, the collapse awaits for Russia, just like in the First World War. We just have to wait for it. This is a shaky analogy, but it is. And sooner or later, now that 2024 has begun, and we see that the whole of Russia, literally the entire Russia, was shaken by the wave of collapses at the Zakhar, like hundreds of houses in big cities, even in the Moscow region, which had never happened before, are sitting without heat, without electricity, and without water, not because of Ukrainian missiles, but because of their utilities. And the fact that they spent money on missiles instead of pipes shows how uncertain their economic base is. They can say whatever they want in statistics, but I, as a historian, not an economist, am absolutely sure that the Russian economy is holding its last breath. And the fact that they are looking for aid in North Korea and Iran shows that they themselves have not pulled this war out. It's important to stand here for a day longer than Russia, not a year, not a month, or a day longer than Russia and Ukraine will win.
We would have a day to rest and a night to stay. I remember that's Gaydar, right? Why did Russia not manage to conquer Kiev in 3 days and the whole of Ukraine in 2 weeks?
I have already said about it. I have already talked about mistakes, so I will not repeat it for a long time. I will emphasize once again that this is a tragic farce with a misunderstanding of what Ukraine is. The Russians were impressed that Ukraine in 2022 is the same as Ukraine in 2014, but it turned out to be nothing like that. Ukraine, as we know it, is like a honey badger, much smaller, but absolutely fierce and fearless. And the Ukrainians fought for themselves like the last time, and finally it helped Ukraine to stand up. If the Russians had planned the war better, then maybe this war would have started at all. But I already said that Putin just didn't hear what he didn't want to hear, and here we are where we are.
This is the property of all dictatorships, as far as I understand, if we go to sociology.
I think that 10 years is the threshold after which the degradation of the feedback recognition begins. A ruler who has been on the throne for less than 10 years still listens to the opposition. And after 10 years, the process of complete degradation begins, and Putin is already sitting for 20 years. And no one will come to his head to say something that he does not want to say.
Can we predict when the war will end? And what will mean the word of victory for Ukraine?
Since my surname is not Arestovich, the war will not end in 2-3 weeks. It is necessary to understand that it may end in 2-3 years. I hope that this will happen sooner. 2023 has taught us that not everything happens as we wish. Our tanks, for example, will not necessarily go to John Coy in the next spring. And we won't drink coffee in Yalta in the summer.
Podolyak said that, not Arestovich.
It means that it happens that no matter what anyone says, it does not happen. Therefore, I will be more careful in my predictions and say that it is necessary to understand what are the levels of victory to see which we have achieved. As for partial victory, Ukraine has already achieved that. We have already won partial victory. That is, we have fought back from the Russian invasion. We have fought back even more than half of the captured territories after the 24th of February. We hold, maybe not as ideally as we would like, but we hold the south and east front. And our economy, of course, thanks to the wide influx of money from the West, is held. We speak because we have electricity. Our sky is much better protected than before, and so on. That is, partial victory of Ukraine is already in our pockets. Then comes the complete victory. Complete victory is what we talk so much about the exit to the borders of 1991. And here I would invite Ukrainians not to be optimistic, but to be realistic, but to expect for a somewhat longer fight on the way to our victory. Because we could not even get to the coast of the Azov Sea, and Crimea is even further. But Crimea is one thing. Who entered Jiangpi already conquered Crimea. This is a well-known historical maxim. Crimea is strong only at Pirikop. If the Pirikop has already been passed, then in the middle of Crimea itself, it is almost impossible to organize the defense. And at the same time, total liberation of Donbass looks very uncertain from the point of view of the military. It is too well unspotted by defense facilities, and in general, density of the urban constructions, there is one of the highest in Europe. And trying to liberate Donbass in a frontal clash would be a catastrophe for Ukraine. That is, complete liberation of Donbass. Perhaps only when we can surround it from the Russian side, or at least the Russians will go away and stop supplying it, then we have a chance. Therefore, we can talk about a complete victory, but to say that it will be there already next year, historically, it would be too optimistic. It would be easier to reconquer Crimea to Donbass. And the final victory Ukraine will achieve will only be when Russia will lose the opportunity to continue the war itself. It is not enough to just kick the Russians to the borders. If the Russians keep their Shahed supplies from Iran or missiles from Korea, they will shoot at Ukraine.
Yes. Well, won't end here.
Yes, it is important that they lost this opportunity. And to lose this opportunity, it is necessary that either they themselves had a civil war inside, or we had such missiles that would reach Moscow. They will attack us, and we will attack them. And this is definitely a matter of at least 5 years. That is, it is necessary to understand that we have already achieved partial victory. It will be a full victory for a year or 2, 3, and final 5 years at least. And if we understand how to eat this elephant in pieces, then we will keep our mental health in check. Because if we hope that next year the war will definitely end, and it will not end, then it will be worth use. Nervous breakdowns. It is better to adjust to a slightly worse situation so that we can then happily meet good news, rather than opposite.
But I think that we, as students in France in 1968, will be realists, demand the impossible.
Well, only like that.
Can Russia switch to a path of democratization? Is it possible for Russia to stop seeing Ukraine as an enemy? Or will they not be able to live without Ukraine?
This is a question for a very broad discussion. Theoretically, when Russia loses a great war, it begins to become a path of liberalization. And we saw this after the Crimean War, after the Russian-Japanese War, and the First World War has already reorganized this country. However, after the victory in the war, for example, in the Russian-German War in 1945, on the contrary, everything only got harsher. Since I am absolutely sure that perhaps not this year, not next, but Russia will lose, there are chances for democratization in Russia. A new government will come, which will exchange the remains of Ukrainian territories for sanctions. And the window will open. But will Russia be able to use this new window? Will it not fall into resentment and then revenge? But we are talking only about the possibilities. They are there. We know for sure that the problem of Russia is the nuclear weapon through which it threatens the whole world. So take the nuclear weapon. We know that the problem of Russia is the hyper-centralization of the government in Moscow. Real democratization, federalization, independence for republics who want to leave. Chechnya must become independent if most Chechens want it. who tries to conquer Chechnya again, he will be immediately tried in Hague. Conditionally speaking, maybe the Chechens don't want it now, they should be axed. The full decentralization of the economy. You can't make oil or diamonds to be mined in Yakutia and the money to remain in Moscow. Then the Moscow is going mad. It is necessary that the money earned by the Yakuts remains in Yakutia, and then the Yakuts may not support the war against the neighbors. So I think that 10 points. So demilitarization, deimperialization, emancipation, condemnation of Putin's gang, dismantling the cult of Putin, because it is impossible to imprison Putin and hope that everything will be fine if the cups or t-shirts with Putin will still be sold. In Germany, they did this process normally. Not only did they imprison the Hitler's leadership, but also banned swastikas. So until Putin's face is banned, there will be no sense. Declericalization should also take place, because the clerics of Russian Orthodox Church, they are such scum who are guilty no less for Putin in what is happening. It is necessary to separate the church in Russia. Whoever wants, let them go to church and keep it for their own money, not from the Russian treasury. And so I think that 10 points, if they are fulfilled, of course, in exchange for the removal of sanctions and economic preferences, and not just like that we will give you money and you can do it someday. No, you need to exchange money in exchange for reforms. Then there will be a chance for Russians to change. The most important thing, I hope, is that this entire old imperialist leadership, who is now in power in Russia, those who are there in the 70s and 80s, KGBRs, special services men, officials, and bandits from the 90s, when they all will be removed from power, when they will leave. Russia will plunge into an internal crisis. It will indeed plunge into a crisis because its population gets old. Population is decreasing. The influx of migrants leads to overgrowth. We will say that in the 50th year, there is a chance, not zero, that Russia will have 50% of the Muslim population. And in short, this raises the question of the internal policy of Russia itself. Many Russians will not accept this, and this will trigger an internal struggle. And in order for the West to support Russia with money and the like, it is necessary that the Russians deal with the internal problem. They will make democratic reforms. They will deal with their immigrants, and they will leave Ukraine. Finally, even Germany, after the Nazis was able to recover in 30 years, there were great difficulties. The occupation of the country, the division of the country, the intensive methods of denazification from the side of the occupying administrations. I think we will not do this in Russia. Russia is too big, and the United States and Germany do not want to repeat it. But if we simply take nuclear warheads and set up a demilitarized zone from their side, then Ukraine will have a chance. If we do not then sit still and instead make our own missiles that strike 1,000 kilometers at least, and our tanks and our fleet and satellites, then we will have a chance. That is, this is all an interconnected process. Internal problems in Russia, its democratization, and the militarization of Ukraine. Finally, the entrance to the NATO. And then we can say that the next generation will live in peace. I think that if we win this war as it should be, then it will be the last Russian-Ukrainian war, and Russia will no longer be able to attack Ukraine. But if we can't do this, then the generation of our children will have to go through and fight this last Russian-Ukrainian war. I would like to end it all this time.
One more question. On your Facebook page, you and Kirill Galushka and some other authors have published an essay about the so-called frontier history of Ukraine. That is, a new approach to a global narrative of the history of Ukraine. If possible, briefly, the main ideas.
Very briefly, because this is a separate topic, I am talking about the Ukrainian historical community. We thought a lot about the fact that the old methods and approaches that we have in Ukraine are not very good. That even the concept of Grushevsky about the Ukrainian people is not very relevant at the beginning of the 21st century, because not only ethnic Ukrainians live in Ukraine, and the borders of Ukraine do not coincide with those borders that were settled by Ukrainians during the time of Grushevsky. And plus, from his views on the Ukrainian elites, we revise that now. We came to the conclusion. In fact, for 10 years, debates have been held in Ukraine about how to present the history of Ukraine. And the frontier approach, or rather the multi-frontier approach, is one of the possible options. I am not saying down with Grushevsky, but instead of him, put this idea. I say that this is one of the possible options for reviewing the approach to the history of Ukraine. Let's look at the history of Ukraine through its border position on the crossroads of the world. Here we have, first of all, we have the world of the settled landowners, mainly Christians, but among whom there are different Christians with different models. Then we have a nomadic steppe world in Ukraine, which existed from the first Indo-Europeans to the Nogais of the 19th century. We have the world of the sea. Among the Mediterranean sea civilizations, we have the mountains, in which their own mountain civilizations arose. And so, the relationship between these different worlds gave birth to such a Ukraine that would not have happened if Ukraine were in some other place. The most important example that everyone in Ukraine understood is the Ukrainian Cossack. The word Cossack itself has been recorded already on the border of the 13th and 14th centuries in the dictionary of the Polovets language. This is a Turkic word that literally means a free man. And the fact that Ukrainian Cossacks wear a Turkic name, look like Turkics with their chub, have Turkic chivalry as a parade outfit. Of course, they did not always wear chivalry, it is difficult, but as a parade outfit. The fact that the words Kosh and Kazan are Turkic. And finally, the word without which you cannot imagine a modern Ukraine, maiden. It is Persian by itself, but came through the Turkic languages. In Crimean Tatar language, the word maiden is almost pronounced the same. And all this shows how important the Turkic was. It's Turkic, but in the broad sense, nomadic contribution to the development of the modern Ukrainian political nation, but even ethnic. We know that the early Slavs did not look like they sing in the latest Ukrainian songs. These black eyebrows, brown eyes, are not Slavic. This is a Turkic decline in the history of Ukraine. In short, saying, not understanding that Ukraine was an intersection of civilizations, it is impossible to understand what Ukraine is and how it is Ukraine. And that is why such a multi-frontier approach. We hope that someday it will take its important place. This year, if nothing extraordinary happens, a collection of works will come out. Unfortunately, this is not a general monograph. It would take decades. It is just a collection of articles in which this approach is somehow revealed. It cannot be said that no one has done this before. Particularly on Cossacks, many works have already come out in recent decades that reveal its place as a community on the frontier. We will try to prove that the frontier approach is characteristic for Ukraine, in the literal sense, from the Neanderthals to today. This year, we will release this collection, manifest this approach, and see how the Ukrainian historical community will perceive it. And there will be a great discussion about how we will manage to move forward.
We will wait. We received information that Mr. Pinchuk is recruiting a team of historians. They announced that there will be Yaroslav Ritsak, Timothy Snyder. There will be another narrative preparation from the history of Ukraine. I know that you had a desire to join this team. How did it all end?
Let's be honest, it's not quite so. I didn't want to join this team. I, as a journalist, was interested in who these historians are. Aside from Snyder, Plohia, and Ritsak, who should be involved in this idea. So I wrote a letter to the organizers with a question on the principle of selection, and they told me that selection does not take place that the search for people does not exist, but you can watch the results on this page. In fact, I know no more than you or anyone else about such an initiative. And on the one hand, I can only congratulate it, because our multi-border approach was created precisely because we were not equipped with old approaches. And we wanted to invent something new. And maybe, if there was not this third phase of the war, if there was not a full-scale invasion, we would have done something similar ourselves. At least, I had the idea to hold a series of meetings in different parts of Ukraine with different historians, and try to do something in the form of the Ukrainian Congress of History in Kyiv. There, where historians could debate about the methods of this teaching of the history of Ukraine. The meeting about the multi-border was held in January 2022. It was the first. It was supposed to be not the only one, but the invasion began, and as you can expect, it was sidelined. So I can only congratulate the idea of such an approach. And I hope that even if the final result won't be good enough in the end for me or anyone else, then the fact that we will discuss it will already contribute to the development of Ukrainian historical science. Whether this will help, whether Pinchuk will be a thorn in this, or vice versa, a promoter of all this, I do not know. We will just see. So I only congratulate the idea itself. And in 3 years, when they promise to do it, we will see.
They promised to do it in 3 years.
At least on the site of this initiative, it is written that the program is calculated for 3 years. And so, after 3 years, I hope, the war will come to a logical conclusion. Ukraine will have to rethink everything, starting with Adam and the Potsdam. We'll see.
And the last question, Mr. Serhiy, do you have any hobbies? I know that besides the usual lying on the couch, because everyone who follows you on Facebook knows about this hobby. Do you have any other hobbies?
When I'm on the couch, I read. And literature, especially fantasy, is a hobby. My little rendezvous with my escapism. I would like to read historical novels, but when in half of the cases, you know roughly how it all ends. You are guided by which side will win. Well, it can be difficult. But fantasy, on the one hand, like secondary literature, secondary worlds. It seems that you already understand what is from which side. And something can be guessed, especially in good fantasy. You can always see historical analogies and the overplay of history. By the way, I also like good alternative history. And on the other hand, not everyone can fully understand who of the heroes will win and why. So reading fantasy and alternative fiction when lying on the couch, I can say that this is basically part of my hobby, and I can say that I am not ashamed of it. I don't cut out trees. I don't go on big hikes, unfortunately. I can't cook truffles, but I'm lying on the couch and reading fantasy.
And crochet isn't your thing either.
Well, no one is perfect.
And the last question, which is beyond everything that is. Have you watched Napoleon by Ridley Scott?
No, hands have not yet reached. I have heard a lot of good and bad about him. I will only watch him to see how Moscow is burning.
Thank you, Mr. Serhiy, for this meaningful conversation. I hope that soon it will all be broadcast.